Okay, why don't we get started? To my team who is allowing people in, of course, let people continue to join us in the course of this as they arrive. If they don't have a place to sit, we should offer them a place to stand. I hope we got that out of the way. Are we under control? All right. It is such a pleasure to see everybody here today. And let's get this out of the way right at the start. Can we please recognize what a special moment it is to be joined by our friend Dolores Huerta? All right. Good, let's do that. Now, Dolores, you and I both know that if this crowd had its way, the applause would have lasted for an hour. But they also want to hear from you. So I want to begin by introducing those of you who haven't had the opportunity to join us previously. We have these conversations every so often with key leaders in our city, in our state, in our nation, and in our world. This is the second in a series. The first, some of you joined us when we had Congressmember Adam Schiff a couple months ago, and now we have our friend Dolores Huerta. I want to thank the members of my team, who are too many to name, who have been instrumental in the logistics today, creating this opportunity. Thank you, City Attorney team, for doing that. And yes. And I want to thank the City Attorney, Latino City Attorneys Association as well, because they're co-sponsoring this event. And I think the president is with us, Will Rivera. Will, most of that applause was for you. Let's just take it like that. Okay, so friends, here's the thing. We are at a moment in our nation's history when we're struggling with many different issues. In particular, one reason that I'm so proud that Dolores is with us is we're struggling to figure out how we can sustain social movements, how we can keep an issue alive for more than the march, the day. How do we do it the next day? And Ms. Huerta has been such a leader for so many years on so many issues. You have a lot to teach us today. I think that most people here would agree, especially because now there's no place to sit anymore. We are all in the presence of greatness. And what I want to do is tell you about the format and then dive in to questions and answers. We're going to talk, Dolores and I, for about 40 minutes or so about a range of issues. We'll see where that conversation takes us. And then we'll have, 15, 20 minutes for Q&A with the audience. We'll have a roving microphone to give you that opportunity to do that, and then we'll conclude. So, having said this, just the briefest biographical sketch, and we'll get into much more detail in half a second. So Dolores Huerta is the president and co-founder of the Dolores Huerta Foundation. She's also the co-founder of the United Farmworkers of America. She has been an activist on the cutting edge of civil rights and social justice for more than 50 years, which is really quite extraordinary. A little reminder of a touch of history with Dolores Huerta. You're the winner of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, right?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. This will be as memorable in a moment as that, but I just want to point that out. You're also the winner of the United States Presidential Eleanor Roosevelt Award for Human Rights, the Eugene V. Debs Foundation Outstanding American Award, and Dolores Huerta has been recognized as one of the 100 most important women of the 20th century. Think about that. Many of you know that California has recognized Ms. Huerta's birthday as a state holiday, not a state holiday, but as a state-designated moment, as has the state of Washington. And you have a number of schools named after you, right?
Yes.
And I think that if I know you enough to know, Dolores, that having a school named for you is particularly meaningful to you because it transmits your history to our kids. But I want to ask you a question now. So, does anybody here know who first coined the phrase, "Si se puede"? Dolores Huerta, that's right. So let's begin with that. So, Dolores, how'd you come up with that?
Well, it was rather interesting. We were in Arizona. Cesar Chavez had just was in the middle of a water-only fast for nonviolence in the state of Arizona because they had passed a law in Arizona that if you said huelga, strike, you could go to prison. If you said boycott anything, you could go to prison. And so we were trying to fight against that law. And I met with a group of our Latino professionals and was inviting them to come and join us to try to overturn this law. And they said, no, you can't do that in Arizona. You can do that in California, but in Arizona, no se puede. You can't do it. And so my response to them, and it came from the universe, I said, "Si se puede" in Arizona, right? Yeah. And so that was my response, and that was the birth of Si se puede.
So how did you feel when Barack Obama adopted Si se puede?
Well, at the time I was actually supporting Hillary.
Yeah.
So I wasn't really happy about that, but when I met the president, he said to me, "I stole your slogan," and I said, "Yes, you did."
Yes, you did, and no, it's okay. So, I want to get into your personal history, in part because I think it suggests to everybody here what their histories can be if they choose to make it so. But before we do, I'm just curious. In the news, of course, is the horrific weekend we just had. Do you have any reaction to the shooting in El Paso, for example?
Well, El Paso and Gilroy also. And, of course, we know Dayton, Ohio,
yes.
where a large number of the victims were African Americans in Dayton, Ohio. And I think my question is this, is that we have to fight racism. So much of this domestic terror, is coming from white supremacists. And what can we in our country do? And I think we're kind of all responsible. What can we do to make sure that we do not grow young people that become terrorists, that become white supremacists, that are people against people of color, against Jewish people, against Muslim people? I mean, what do we have to do in our democratic society? And I think it's not going to change unless every single private and public organization takes on the issue of racism, anti-Semitism, misogyny, homophobia, etc. I attended a 3-day conference at the LBJ Library in Austin, Texas. They had a 3-day conference on racism. And I think that every single organization has got to challenge this right now. I don't think we can wait. Our school children, number one, they need to know what the contributions are of people of color. that it was African slaves that built the White House and the Congress and many of the buildings in our country, and immigrants that came from various parts of the world, India, Mexico, Japan, China, the Philippines, all of these immigrants, and also the people from Europe. But if our children are not taught this, our kids of color will never have the dignity that they deserve to know what their people did. And our white children, we can erase that whole idea of white privilege and white supremacy, but we've got to act on it right now. And the other thing, too, I like to say this. There's one basic piece of science, and that basic piece of science is that we are only one human race. We don't have a lot of human races. That word race should be kind of erased because we have ethnic groups, but we do not have various human races, only one. And our human race came from Africa. It's got to be repeated and repeated and repeated because we are all Africans of different shades and colors. And so we can say to the neo-Nazis, to all those white nationalists out there, get over it, you're Africans, okay? Just get over it,
So I'm interested in whether some of the views you just expressed are what led you to start the Dolores Huerta Foundation.
Well, luckily I learned how to organize by a great human being named Fred Ross Sr., and I love to say to a lot of us Latinos that the godfather of the Chicana movement was an Anglo named Fred Ross Sr. And he taught Cesar Chavez and myself how to do basic organizing, grassroots organizing, meeting in people's homes, explaining to them that they have power, that they can make the changes that they need, and that they don't have to wait for anybody to come and do it for them. And so this is the way that we organized in the Community Service Organization, which started here in Los Angeles, in East Los Angeles. Ed Roy Ball, as you know, was the first Latino city councilman that sat here in this chamber, and the first Latino congressman to go to Congress. And so we learned how to organize in CSO. We passed many, many laws in the Community Service Organization, and then we left that organization to start the United Farmworkers. And we used the same organizing method, just meeting in people's homes, a few at a time. Showing them that people that look like themselves were able to organize in their communities. And we used the same method then to start the Dolores Huerta Foundation.
Well, I want to return to that in a second, but first I think we should take our audience through a little bit of your personal history. Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Stockton, California. And the reason I loved growing up there, it's a rural area, a rural city, but it's close to San Francisco. But the thing is that we were so ethnically diverse, and that was, which I consider a real blessing, because my neighbors were Italian immigrants, Greek immigrants, from the Philippines, China, Japanese. We even had a young man from Afghanistan that grew up in our neighborhood. And then the Okies, the young people that had just come, here during the Dust Bowl days. So just learning all of these diverse cultures, I think, was just a blessing that really prepared me for the work that I had to do.
Well, who first sparked your interest in civil rights?
Well, actually, I think it was just being a young woman of color and seeing the type of harassment that that we were subjected to by the police, stopping us when we came home from a football game or a basketball game, and just always stopping us, frisking us, and treating us differently than my classmates who were Anglo. And it kind of brings all that anger, being discriminated in my school, in my high school. And so at first you don't really know what you can do about anything like this, but once that you learn that you can change it, and then so that's why I say once I learned how to organize, I thought, well, wow, this is the way that we can tackle the situation, that we don't have to take it like this when we're discriminated. And one of my friends who was African American, when we were in high school, she said she wanted to be a nurse, and they told her, "Oh, you can't be a nurse. You've got to learn how to do domestic work, because this is the only kind of a job that you can get." Luckily, she ignored them, and she became a nurse.
Yes.
But so many of us, and unfortunately, that still happens today. We see, what we're talking about earlier, now it's gone to the level that this discrimination, this racial discrimination, now gets to the point that you think that you have to kill people just because they happen to be of a different color of skin.
Yeah. And you actually first decided to become a teacher, right?
Yes, and I did that, of course, because I had gone through a divorce and I had two small children, so I went back to school to get my teaching credential.
Yeah. Why did you leave teaching?
Well, I left teaching because so many of the schools that I was teaching in, I saw that the farmworker children were being so neglected and deprived and so poor. And often I had to go fight with my principals to try to get a free lunch or try to get a voucher for shoes. And many of the principals, I should say many of them, one of them in particular, who happened to be from Arkansas, and yet a lot of the children that were in the school that I was teaching were the Dust Bowl children. And he said to me, their parents, all they do is drink up the money that they get. And I knew that wasn't true. I knew they worked very, very hard, but were earning like 50 cents an hour for their labor. And so having learned how to organize, I thought, I can do better by organizing the parents.
And I think your first organizing stint was with the community service organization, right?
Yes, it was.
So what was most memorable to you about your CSO work?
Well, I guess the first thing is just, I should say this too, that I was a volunteer for 5 years with the organization before I was ever hired as an organizer. And so I learned the value of just being a volunteer. Again, I learned the value of organizing people, that you could bring them together. And then passing all the laws that we did. We passed some very significant laws. And one of them I like to talk about because I lobbied through the state legislature in 1963. How many years ago was that? That you could, if you were a citizen, you could register another person to vote. Which we can do now. As you know, we have all of these wonderful ways that we can register people to vote. And the reason I mention this is because in Texas, when we ask what's wrong with Texas, guess what? They have the registration model that we had here in California back in the 50s and the 60s. Mm-hmm. And in Texas, you can't register to vote. You've got to find a deputy registrar somewhere. You can't do absentee ballots, And that's, again, I guess learning how democracy works. Learning that you can register people to vote and that you can, how to lobby also, how to pass legislation. And this was really a wonderful tool, and because this is where the power is at, to make sure that we can get good people elected to office. So I think those are my greatest lessons I learned in CSO, which we then took to the farm worker movement, and we were able to pass unemployment insurance for farm workers, giving farm workers the right to organize, et cetera.
Yeah, I actually want to get to that. So you went there to the Agricultural Workers Association, and then you met Cesar Chavez, yes?
Well, actually, the Agricultural Workers Association was a group I organized in Stockton. Cesar was organizing people farm workers in Oxnard. I turned my group over to the AFL-CIO at that time, AWOC, Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee. And then I ended up leaving because they started working a lot with labor contractors who were really exploiting people. And Cesar had the same experience. He turned his group over to another labor union, and then it kind of fell apart. So it was in fact, it was here in Los Angeles. We were working with CSO, and Cesar called me over to his home right there in East LA on Folsom and Fickett. I remember the house. And he said, we've got to organize a union. And I thought he was kidding. I started laughing. And no, he said, we've got to do this. But then what he said in the next breath, we will never see a national union in our lifetime. And I said, why, Cesar? He says, because the growers are too rich, they're too racist, and they're too powerful.
So I'm curious, in that dynamic, he's saying it can't be done.
No, he's saying a national union.
A national one.
Yeah.
From your standpoint, how did you react to that? Did you say, wait a second, si se puede, or did you say, I'm not so sure?
Well, I just listened, and I realized that we were both in our early 30s when we started the United Farm Workers, but at the same time, we knew that we had to begin. At least if we could do it in California, And I actually think that we probably could have organized a national union because of the boycott. But so many people supported us and didn't buy grapes, and then didn't buy lettuce, didn't buy gallon wine, and so many people. So we were actually, once we were able to get the union going, I think we could have organized a national union, but. What happened, and I know there's probably some Teamsters in the house, okay, so I know that none of you are responsible for what happened, but by 1973, we had about 100,000 members in the union. We had a lot of contracts in California, the grapes and the citrus, in the lettuce, in the vegetable industry. We had contracts in Texas. We had contracts in New Mexico. And when you think about these are the states except Texas that grow the largest number of agricultural products. But then the Teamsters Union came in, and they kind of destroyed everything that we were trying to do. So we went from 100,000 members to 27,000 in one, you might say, in a few months.
Let's talk about those boycotts for a second. I'm curious, when you're organizing a boycott to get something, to achieve something, the workers have a lot at risk when that happens, because dwindling demand for the work that they're doing could lead them to be laid off. They could lose their jobs for the sake of the greater good. How did you deal with that tension between wanting to stand up for the workers, but also recognizing that that leadership could lead them to sacrifice something?
Well, you have to organize the workers so they can understand. And in fact, when we started the strike and farm workers had to stop working altogether, many farm workers lost their homes, they lost their cars, but yeah, people had to sacrifice. And of course, a lot of people may not know this, but there were 5 farm workers that were killed in the struggle. Mm-hmm. And when you think about that, 5 farm workers were killed. The first one was a young Jewish girl named Nan Friedman, who was killed in Florida in one of our sugarcane strikes over there. And then the second one was a young Arab, a young man from Ammon named Naji Daipala. And the first one was Nan Friedman. And then the third one was a Catholic farm worker, Juan de la Cruz, and then there were 2 other workers that were killed. So we had 5 workers that were killed just to try to get basic human rights for farm workers. And when we think about how could that be that the agricultural industry would go to those lengths to kill people just so farm workers could have a toilet in the fields, and to have cold drinking water, and to have rest periods, and unemployment insurance, and the right to organize. But that's what happened.
Who came up with the idea that to galvanize public support, there should be a boycott?
Well, actually, it was one of our attorneys. His name is Stu Weinberg. He's in the San Francisco area, and we kept picketing, and they kept bringing in strike breakers, and you'd get people out of the field, and the next day we're so close to Mexico that they could bring workers in overnight practically, and so the next day there would be a whole new crew in the fields, and this kept on for several months, and Mr. Weinberg was one of our volunteer attorneys, and he said, "Why don't you try a boycott?" And they had done the bus boycott, in Selma and Montgomery, and so we said, "Okay, let's try the boycott." And so some of our young volunteers, they hitchhiked and they went to the different cities, and we took on our first company was a wine company, Shenley, who also had liquor. And guess what? Within 6 months, we were able to get a contract with them after we started the boycott. So we thought, okay, this is the way that we do it.
You became a negotiator of those contracts, right?
Yes.
Had you any previous experience as a negotiator?
I hadn't, but I had done the legislative work in Sacramento. And so Caesar thought because I had that knowledge of learning how to write legislation and lobbying that then I could go into negotiations. So I met with a lot of the labor leaders, and then some of the head of the Longshoremen's Union, head of the Carpenters Union, and they told me how to negotiate. And the one thing they said is, don't have attorneys in the room, which is kind of interesting. Always just deal with the workers.
Now, for what it's worth, you just said something heroic about a lawyer and setting up a boycott. We got a lot of lawyers here.
I know.
And then you said lawyers shouldn't be in the room. It's very upsetting.
And we actually did end up having some attorneys in the room, but they just felt that the way that the stronger the contracts that you get that are stronger, they come from the workers, because basically as a negotiator, you're just interpreting what the workers want. You're going to kind of just a go-between. And it's true, once you get attorneys in the room, then the language gets more, more and more words.
Yes,
more
we
and more
know.
confusing,
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
So, Dolores, I have so many questions, but I want to take our audience, many of whom were not alive when the first boycotts were happening, to the fields themselves. Can you describe what was really at stake for human beings working as farm workers when you first started?
Well, as I said before, the wages were very low. In California, when we started organizing, the wages were like about 70 cents an hour. The workers had to work very long hours in the very hot sun, as we know. I just came from Bakersfield right now. It's pretty hot up there right now. And there were no toilets, especially for the women. Can you imagine that? And no drinking water. People had to work very, very hard. In fact, once we got our medical plan, we found out that one of the biggest issues that the farm workers had were heart problems, because they were kind of brutalized. They had to work so hard. And they didn't have any kind of, again, medical plan or kind of retirement. And so these are the things that there were a lot of children in the fields. And then, of course, the pesticides. One of the things that we were able to do is when I negotiated the contracts, I was able to negotiate the times that workers would go into the fields after they had been sprayed, and that they had to post them. And it was all because before we had a language in our contracts, they would spray the fields and put the workers in right the next day. Or sometimes they would spray it at night and put workers in. And so we had, as you know, a lot of children that were deformed and really high rates of cancer. And I just have to say to this, add this, for people that want to buy grapes, buy organic grapes, please. Because unfortunately, the United Farm Workers, they don't have that many contracts in the grape fields. And so the only way that you can make sure that the grapes that you are eating are not poisoned is to buy organic grapes, because they keep it, even though we were able to get rid of a lot of the poisons that they were using on the grapes, things like DDT, parathion, malathion, dinoseb, all of these poisons. Guess what? They make new ones. They make new poisons, and we've just been having a struggle getting some of these restricted poisons off the market. President Trump, unfortunately, took some of these poisons that were restricted and put them back on the market.
I don't want to pass through this period of history without asking you this. You were a woman in the midst of this effort. Not a lot of female labor leaders in those days. How did that affect you? What interactions did you have with the guys as you were going through this process, including the guys who were on your side?
Well, I think women are always in the struggle on the front lines. In every single movement, you see women that are on the front lines. What happens is after the dust settles and they start apportioning, the hierarchies or the positions of power, that's where you see women getting left out. I think in my case, I was very fortunate because since Cesar and I started the organization, the workers knew me, and I was the negotiator, and so I had a lot of support from the workers, which is probably kind of unusual. Where I ran into issues was with other male leadership, okay? And I think women understand that.
Do you want to elaborate on that, or just assume people understand?
No, I think people understand.
Yeah.
Well, we know that machismo is still alive and well in our society. Yeah. I think that we're working hard to get rid of it. I think the Me Too movement and, Women's Lives Matter movement are kind of changing this. So I think right now we're at a threshold in our society. We're seeing a change in that. We have seen with so many that have been elected to state offices, to Congress, et cetera. And it's happening all over the country, You see that there are so many more women now in leadership positions. And as you know, Governor Brown, they passed a law in the state legislature. Every corporation in California has to have at least one woman on the board. I think so. Little by little, we're changing that.
We were talking about idealism earlier. You knew Bobby Kennedy, right?
Yes.
Describe a little bit about what you found inspiring about him and any interactions you had that might be secrets that you can tell all our friends here.
Well, he had a great sense of humor. I think kind of people know that. But he was very genuine. He was very, very authentic. And what I liked about Senator Kennedy, and also about Ted Kennedy also, that they're the kind of people that they don't say, I know what's good for you. They ask, what do you need? How can I help you? Very, very humble in that respect, very respectful, very genuine. And we all know it was a great loss when we lost Senator Kennedy. But I also want to say that the Kennedy children, Robert's children, Carrie Kennedy, she's head of the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization, and they're doing a lot of work on the international level and on the local level with the work that they do, social justice work. Robert Kennedy Jr. Does a lot of work on the environment. Corey Kennedy, who does a lot of documentaries. So they're all very active. Kathleen Kennedy also, who is working. This is really interesting for everybody. Kathleen Kennedy is working on a national plan for retirement, because a lot of people don't have retirement plans. They don't work for government, they don't work for labor unions, or they don't belong to labor unions, so they don't have retirement plans. And so she's working on a national government plan so that everybody in the country can have some kind of retirement to go along with the Social Security when they retire.
Right, and you of course were on the stage with Bobby Kennedy the night he was assassinated at the Ambassador Hotel here in Los Angeles. Let me ask you to shift gears a little bit and talk about your role as a legislative advocate in Sacramento. We've alluded to it a few times that you've had a key role in passing legislation. What makes an effective advocate, especially for a group that doesn't make big campaign contributions, that doesn't vote? That's a tough gig. I served in Sacramento. When you're an advocate for a group that doesn't have those attributes, working against groups that make major campaign contributions, that represent large numbers of voters, is not easy. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I think the first thing is you have to educate the legislator that you're trying to convince to vote on the law that you want passed. And then you've got to go to their constituents, okay? Because actually what they care about is the people that vote for them. And so just recently we were trying to pass a bill on farmworker housing, and the chair of that committee was not going to bring up the bill. So guess what? We just called the people in his district, okay? And we said, your senator is not being very helpful to get this bill passed. Well, after he got a few hundred calls, he said, okay. So lobbying, basically, you have to go to the people that elect someone. And if they don't do their job, then you got to take them out, So I believe that you try to elect good people, and if they are not doing what they should be doing in terms of passing laws that help people, then they should be taken out and get somebody else there.
So how did you decide as an advocate? You were more than an advocate. You were a person who formulated ideas for legislative change. What's the bill that you're proudest of? Oh,
wow. There's so many. I mentioned the voter registration bill, disability insurance bill for farm workers at the California level. Another one that is really effective today at the national level, and that was that people who were legal immigrants to the United States of America could get public assistance, because before that they couldn't get public assistance. And today we have millions of legal immigrants that are able to get aid to the blind, aid to disabled people, aid to needy children, etc., and old age pensions, if they're here as legal immigrants. And then the big one, of course, is the amnesty bill of 1986, which a couple of million farm workers were able to get legalization in this country.
Of all your experiences in Sacramento, what made you the angriest?
I think the disappointment for all of us is when we elect someone and work really hard for someone, and then they really are not supporting progressive legislation. And sometimes that person may be a Latino, that person may be a woman, somebody that we thought would really work for the community, and then they don't. And I think that makes me really angry, especially when you know that they're not voting for progressive legislation because they're getting money from the oil companies, they're getting money from the tobacco companies. Their vote is not for people, it's for where they're getting their bucks from.
So, of all the issues that farm workers faced previously, still, farm workers endure very tough conditions. What is the one thing that you would like to see still change when it comes to conditions for farm workers?
Well, the main issue is, again, going back to that first statement of Cesar, when he said that the growers are too racist. And in fact, I had a conversation. I'm not going to name any names. I had a conversation in Stockton. I was in Stockton. A very famous person that if I said his name, everybody would know. But they were getting a lot of money from the government to feed farm workers during the Bracero period, when they brought in millions of people from Mexico during World War II. And this man was a doctor, and he said to this particular grower, you do realize that the food that you are feeding these workers is not adequate nutrition for them for the hard work that they're doing. And the answer was, well, I'm not here to take care of their health. I'm here to make money. And I think that's something that's wrong in our entire society, not just with the agricultural owners. And I'm not saying that they're all like that, because obviously they're not. But when people think of the profit motive, that all we want to do is make money, and we don't think of the health of the people in our communities, the fact that people need housing, that they need health care, that some people don't have food. I think there was today in National Public Radio, in California, we have a huge number of millionaires and billionaires, but yet we have some of the highest poverty rates. And the poverty rates that we have in our state of California are often the farm workers, the children of farm workers. And so I think that this has got to change. Just as our whole philosophy of what our democracy is and what our country is has got to change.
So let's talk about how to change it. I'm really curious. You were able, through the boycotts, among other things, to galvanize a nation. Mm-hmm. And one boycott after another, people kept with it, and the cause was sustained. Today, there are many causes, many challenges, from climate change to racial justice, a whole array of issues. If you were to tell activists in this room 2 or 3 lessons that you've learned as an activist that enable the movement to live another day, as opposed to petering out after a brief flash, what would you say?
Well, I would say to people that we all have to become activists. And I like to quote Helen Keller, who said that scientists have not been able to cure the worst disease in human beings, and that is apathy. And so many people are not involved. We have to get involved. Every single person in our democracy has got to be involved. And if we're not involved, we don't have a democracy. And that's what's happening right now. I mean, there's no lack of issues to get involved in. So it's not only about voting, which we have to get everybody to vote, but if we don't go out there and get other people to vote, and if we don't get involved in some of these movements that need volunteers right now, things won't get any better. So we have a real crisis, I think, right now in our country, and we are seeing it every single day in the economic issues when we have. And I know when I was growing up, I never saw a homeless person on the street. One of my daughters, we were talking, and I told her I had never seen a homeless person when I was growing up. And now we have how many homeless people in Los Angeles? 60,000 homeless people in Los Angeles and all over the country. How can this be when we are the richest country in the world? How can it be that we do not have free health care for everybody, free education for everybody like they have in Europe, in the Scandinavian countries, like they have in little teeny Cuba? Which is a very poor country, but everybody has free education, they have free health care. So we've got to step up, and we've got to start asking some hard questions and making sure that we change this. And right now, my foundation, we're really focused on the school-to-prison pipeline. And we have had to sue our high school district because of the racism in our high school district, where they expelled 2,600 kids in a year and a half. 2,600, and they were African American and Latino. And we were able to change that by that lawsuit, and from 2,600 expulsions, we got it down to 26. From 2,600 to 26. We had to sue our Board of Supervisors because we had no representation, even though the vast majority of Kern County, believe it or not, are people of color. Mm-hmm. Over 50% are Latinos. We had no representation on the board. Only one Latina person, and needless to say, all of the votes that they make are against people of color. So we've got to change this, but we all have to get involved in doing it.
So you mentioned a key ingredient in making that change is inspiring people to cut through the apathy and get people motivated. What other steps, if you were telling an aspiring activist, teaching that person how to be really effective, you would say, look, I organized the boycotts in the 60s and early 70s. I can tell you, besides inspiration, there are two other ingredients. What would you say?
Well, let me give you a good example. And there were a lot, this is going to be political, but I'm going to say this, but there were a lot of people, and maybe some of you in this audience, that boarded buses to go to the Central Valley in this last election. And they went out there knocking door to door in the very hot sun to make sure that we got a couple of good people elected to the U.S. Congress, okay? Now, that took some sacrifice, to go from Los Angeles to go to the broiling heat up there in Fresno and Bakersfield and some of those areas up there to knock on doors to inform voters about why they should vote for a better person to represent that area. That's what it's got to be physical, and we've got to appropriate some time, a few hours a week. If it's phone banking, if it's knocking on doors, if it's volunteering, to be able to join some of our movements to make sure that we start addressing the critical issues that we have, whether it be the climate change issue, whether it's the criminal justice issues, the racism issues, the misogynist, the homophobic issues that we have. There's so much work for us to do.
What led you to transition from farm workers to feminism?
Well, I think, my mother was, I grew up with my mother, single parent. She was a feminist before her time. But at some point, I realized that we need to have more women's voices. And I saw many of the women in the farm worker movement. They're very strong women. But as I said before, when we came to our executive board, there were very few women. And so, again, that's where the machismo plays in. And you don't have women in the decision-making positions. And I like to quote Coretta Scott King, who said, "We will never have peace in the world until women take power." We will never have peace in the world until women take power. Now, I have amended that with Coretta's permission to say we will never have peace in the world until feminists take power. Because we know you can be a woman and not have a feminist point of view, but also I think many men in this room are also feminists. So that's why I'd like to amend that statement.
So fair enough. We're going to take questions from the audience in like 3 or 4 minutes, but I'd like to ask you a couple fairly personal questions. Mm-hmm. You've said before that you've sometimes in your history been reluctant to take credit for your achievements. And I wanted you to share a little bit about why you think that is.
Oh, I think that's the way that we as women are socialized. We as women are social to young girls. I say, yeah, when there's a position over there that you would like to apply for, and you think, well, I'm not really that prepared or educated for that position, just do it like the guys do, right? Learn on the job.
All right. So get your questions warmed up. In about 2 minutes, you're going to be there. I'd like to conclude my round of questioning. I have 100 more questions, but I want our audience to get a chance to weigh in with this. Being, if we're going to be direct about it, being an iconic leader comes with sacrifice. I don't just mean long hours. I know from my own life, which is tiny by comparison to yours, balancing the ability to be at home, be with your family, and be out in the world, extremely hard to do. And you have made an enormous difference in the world. How does one balance all those goals that one has in life, to family, to causes, to everything, to yourself?
Well, again, it comes back to the issue of being a woman. I think often women feel very guilty when they have to rely on other people to help them take care of their children. And that's one of the things that we have to kind of get over that. I think I knew that the work that we were doing was so important that I had to ask other people to help me, starting with relatives or friends. And in the Farmworkers movement, we did have daycare. We did have daycare for all of our children. In fact, we had the first daycare for farmworker children in the whole state of California. But that's why we need to have early childhood education for all of our children, because we need more women to get active in civic life. And I think that goes for men also. But that's one of the things that we have to overcome, that guilt, because we need women's voices, we need women's intuitions, women's intelligence as decision makers. So I think when we think of the bigger cause, and again going back to all of the critical issues that we have in our society today, that yes, we've got to overcome the guilt and just say, I need help. Can you help me?
Fair enough. All right. Audience, we have time for a few questions. If people are too shy, I have plenty myself. Who has a question they'd like to ask? Yes. Okay, so Sarkis, you want to bring the microphone over and we'll get started here.
Good afternoon. This is on? Okay. My name is Zakia Kator. I'm a DCA here in City Hall. And I also am an activist outside the office here. But as I'm listening to you, I was so impressed with just really practical advice you're giving on how to get people involved and motivated in local politics and elections. And I'm curious, it seems to me that everything you're talking about, I want to know, when you first started out in the 70s, how have things changed now? And are things better or worse as far as getting people involved and to be motivated and active in making the world a better place, 40 years after you were involved with the Farmworkers movement? Thank you.
I think, well, some things were better when I was growing up in terms of, say, we had really small classrooms at that point in time. One thing that people don't realize is in California, we were kind of doubled in population, and our tax structure has not kept up. And so this is why we don't have enough money for education. We don't have enough money for health care. And so some of those things were better. I think the things, better than the things I think, but I'm going to say this about, again, going back to racism. Racism has always existed in our society, starting with slavery, unfortunately. And the one thing that's happening now with racism being so out in front and these horrible slayings that we have just heard of the last weekend, that the fact that it's out there now and it's so visible means that we've got to address it. What's good in terms of organizing is that you have all of the devices. I think many of us probably saw on television where people were protesting in Washington, D.C. about the slayings. That happened like instantly. So people can communicate and they can organize very quickly. And then the fact that knowledge is accessible to everybody. Everything is so transparent. You can Google everything. And so people really can't hide anymore. Everything is more transparent now than it was before. And so I think in some ways people are more aware. But the one thing that is lacking is that we don't have a historical knowledge, a historical education, especially among our young people, because many things that I was taught in school, like civics, is kind of not being taught anymore. History is not being taught. History of the labor movement. These things are not being taught. So young people don't know, like if I say to an audience, do you know how we got the 8-hour day? Maybe a couple of people will raise their hands. Do you know what happened to the labor leaders that fought for the 8-hour day? They were executed, they were hung. Yet all of us enjoy the 8-hour day, but none of us know how we got there to the 8-hour day. So those are the things that have to be remedied.
Other questions?
Hi, buenas tardes, señora. My name is Crisanta Gonzalez, and I was just wondering, at what point in your lifetime did you realize that your personal sacrifice were going to make a huge impact on a global, historical, bigger picture, that you were going to become like a part of something that's going to affect millions of people generations forward?
Well, I don't think that was even in my thought process. You're basically just trying to do the work. You're trying to change things. You don't think in terms of a historical perspective. In fact, my young son, Ricardo, he says, Mom, you're not an icon, you're an ICANN.
Fair enough. I'm going to interrupt the flow of questions for 1 second, although there are questioners here, and I'll leave it to my team to go there. I don't want the day to end without you answering this. You know, you're 89 years old. Can I be you when I grow up? As you reflect on your life so far, with many, many, many years to come, what is the one thing that you want people to know is your legacy?
Well, I would like for people to know that as an organizer, our job is to organize people to let them know that they have power. And that each one of us has to really, really understand that and act on it. You know, because I think if we can do that, and this is why people tell me, well, why don't you retire? Well, I think if there's one more community that we can go into and then we could show people that they have power, especially poor people, like in the organizing work that my foundation has done, you know, we have people that are on school boards, city councils, recreation boards, and these are people that never went to high school. People that speak very broken English, but once they learn that they have power, they can improve their communities, and this is what they do. And they can get themselves elected to office, because we've got to get into those positions of decision-making positions of power, so we can end corruption in our school boards or in our communities, and that we can pass policies that help the community, not just have people come in there that are there for the money or for the job, but are really there to help people.
But you want people to believe in themselves.
Believe in themselves and to act on their power, not just sit back and say, okay, oh my goodness, things are so terrible, what are we going to do? No, we've got to act. And if we all do this, then we can kind of create the kind of a world that we need.
Sounds kind of like Si Se Puede to me.
Yes, it is a Si Se
All right, other questions?
Hi, my name's Karen Hernandez. I work with the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment, so I love what you were just saying about empowering folks. Actually, we try to reach folks that are undocumented, you know, folks that are usually not involved in their local government. It is an inclusive system. So my question to you is, what advice do you have for folks that do reach those positions of power and may face some pushback from other folks that maybe aren't welcoming? At the end of the day, people get together to try to work towards the betterment of their community, but sometimes there are different views and people might feel intimidated or even feel like maybe they shouldn't continue. So what advice do you have for folks like that, or even for folks working with them, to encourage them to keep going?
Well, when we see it, like, let's take an example, like a school board. Like I was talking about how we sued the Kern High School District for the discrimination against African American and Latino children. So whatever the issue is, there's some public official or agency that is responsible for that problem. So you get organize some friends to go with you, or relatives, and go and start confront them about the issue that you're concerned about, like we did with the racial discrimination against our students in Kern County. But the one thing is that you can't do it by yourself. Always organize a few friends or neighbors or allies to go with you. And that's the main thing, is just to, talk to people and get a few people involved to make it happen. I like to tell people, there's a big, when you see movies about the farm worker movement, we started, there were 70 farm workers that started marching to Sacramento from Delano during the strike, the farm worker strike. Well, 70 people left Delano. When they got to Sacramento, there were 10,000. There were 10,000 because they marched, they talked to people along the way. Cesar and I and his wife, Helen, there were the three of us that started the farm worker movement. And then we were joined by his brother, Richard, by his cousin, Manuel, and a few more people. So sometimes it just takes the militant few, right, to start doing something. And the thing is that we learn along the way, and we make mistakes along the way. The main thing is to learn from the mistakes and not to give up. Because the only time that we lose is when we give up. And especially the school boards. School boards in California, now they have a mandate from the state under Governor Jerry Brown that they get a lot of money they get their money directly now from the state legislature. But as part of them having that money directly, they have to appropriate special funding for low-income children, for foster children, for English learners. But a lot of the school districts don't do that. And so you've got to confront them. We just recently had a case up in California City, way up in the high desert. In that, we went into that area because 81%, 8 out of 10 African American students were being expelled and suspended. 8 out of 10 children. And they would call in the police when the kids did something wrong. I'm happy to say that has reduced, but also they now had to form an African American parent committee in that Mojave School District, okay? So we still have a lot of work to do because we've got to change the school board. We've got to change the school board, and after the census of 2020, we'll be able to do that. So, we've got to work from the bottom up. Just think about that, from the bottom up, and that's how we make the changes. And in a democracy, we can make that happen. But if people don't engage, if people don't participate, if people don't take action, then nothing changes.
We have time for 2 more questions. Sarkis, on your territory here?
Hello, well, I think she went ahead.
I'm confused. Okay, so we'll take one here. Good.
Thank you for your time. My name is Sagalam, and I really, when you were talking, I see my life too, in my own way. I was doing what you were doing. And you raised 2 things. One, the discrimination and the woman's role. Yes, unless we change the role, men cannot understand what women do, unless for one day they do what we do. Meaning, like how to raise kids, we are working, we are raising kids, we are taking the family. The men cannot understand how much time we spend doing all that and balancing our life, unless we change our role for one day. So is the other. He said, all of us are from Africa. That being a good point, a white person cannot understand what the black kid goes through unless he changes the role. He gets hurt, and my son tells me, Mom, I cannot go from here to there before a police stops me and for no reason handcuff me and go through my car. So nobody can understand it unless you walk through that, which we cannot do it. Only thing we can do is fight for a better change. We talk about endangered species.
Actually, can I ask you, because
no,
our time
I'm
is
going
over-
to, I'm going to my
please?
question. So my question to you is, how can, right now you told us, how can all of us join in your movement or volunteer in your movement? If you can give everybody a suggestion where we can go to join you, or that will be a great, how can we do that?
Well, thank you for that question. At the Dolores Huerta Foundation, we're on the web, and it's really simple. It's doloreshuerta.org. DoloresHuerta.org is our website, and people can log on to our website. And as we get more funding, we can go into more communities and organize more people, because the issues that I'm talking about in the Central Valley, there are issues that are happening all over the United States of America and here in Los Angeles. Just one thing I want, in terms of our tax dollars, because we pay, unfortunately, for a lot of the things that are happening. When you cross the Grapevine and you go into the Central Valley, from Bakersfield to Sacramento, we have built in the state of California 22 prisons. We have 1 university, University of Merced. This is our tax dollars, 22 prisons and 1 university. So these are the things that we have to think about, and look at our systems of incarceration. We have more people in prison in California than any other state. We have more people in prison in the United States of America than any other country, including India or China. Their populations are billions of people. Billions of people. The United States, we're 300 million. So something's wrong with the system that we are living in, where we are and making money off of putting people in prison. These private prisons, so we have to change our systems, our incarceration systems that are punishing so many people, especially people of color, And just one other thing, too, I want to say to everybody here, my organization, the Dolores Huerta Foundation, we are already starting to organize for the census. Okay? Because we know that a lot of people, especially people of color, especially Latinos, are going to be afraid to sign up for the census because of the Trump administration's attack on Latinos. And the citizenship question, which Trump was trying to put on the census, is not going to be there. because luckily we sued the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund. We were plaintiffs on that, and we won. So there will be no citizenship question on the census.
Yeah.
But I just, so we want everybody to, again, how can we help? How can we volunteer? If everybody in their neighborhood could just tell people in your neighborhood why it's important to be counted. Because for every single one of us, can you imagine, those of us that are sitting here, every one of us that is counted, we bring in $2,000 into our neighborhood and our community. Over 10 years, that's $20,000. Each one of us is worth $20,000 in government funding to come to our community. And so if we don't get counted, how much money do we lose? So it's so important also for representation, for the kind of stuff that we're talking about. Representation on our school boards, our city councils, in the legislature and in the Congress. So we want to say to everybody, please do your work, call your neighbors, call your friends, and please remind them they have to get counted in the census in April of 2020.
And you'll be pleased that we were plaintiffs in that litigation too. Last question.
Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Cynthia Ruiz. And first of all, I want to say thank you to our City Attorney, Mike Feuer, for hosting this.
Of course.
And Dolores, you know that you're one of my sheroes. So you were talking about feminism and how men can be feminists. Can you talk a little bit more about what your definition of feminism is?
Well, a feminist is somebody who believes in women's rights, including the right to abortion, a person who believes in immigrant rights, and obviously, to know that we have climate change, believe in a healthy environment for our planet. Someone who believes in LGBTQ rights also, and that is all, and of course, workers' rights. This is how I describe a feminist, that's why. And I think that all of us should be thinking, because the things I'm talking about are really human rights. Human rights, a woman's right to have control over her own body, a person's right to love and marry whomever they choose, okay? That's their human right. And we have other human rights that are not met, like our education and healthcare that I mentioned earlier.
So the hour is now over.
And before we end, could I just ask everybody a question?
Course.
Okay, so everybody has been asking me questions, so now I'm going to ask you all a question. And in fact, but when I ask you the question, I want you to shout out the answer really, really loud. I think it's okay, Mike?
Sure.
Okay, and so the answer is this one. It's a really simple one. I'm going to ask you the question, who's got the power? And I want you to say, we've got the power. And when I say, what kind of power? I want you to yell out people power. But I want you to yell it out so loud that all of the white nationalists can hear us, okay? And the homophobes and the misogynists, okay? Okay, so let's go. Don't forget, shout out really loud. Let's make the rafters ring, okay? As patriots. Who's got the power? We got the power! What kind of power? So, are we going to go out there, we're going to volunteer, we're going to organize, we're going to get people active? What do we say? ¿Se puede o no se puede? Sí se puede. Okay, let's all do it with an organized hand clap. Let's go. Sí se puede. Can I just say that I want to thank you for doing this? I don't know how many public officials do this, but it should be mandated that they should, to be able to invite people to come here and to discuss topics of importance that are affecting every single one of us. And I think this is very admirable of you, and I just want to thank you for that and for inviting me.
Dolores Huerta, I am proud to be your friend. Thank you for joining us today. Everybody, let's recognize Dolores Huerta. See the flag?
Oh, There's a documentary called Dolores. If you haven't seen it, it's on Independent Lens. It was produced by Carlos Santana and directed by Peter Bratt, and it's available on public television, PBS.
Excellent. All right, everybody, we are now concluded. The young man with the flag, I want you to come up here for a second. Sir, how old are you? 6 years old. What's your name? Santos. Have you met Dolores Huerta?
Yes, he did.
Oh, you have already.
We took a picture.
You know Santos?
Yes, we met
Okay,
a
very
while
good.
ago.
It's very nice to meet you. Okay, everybody. See you later.